Welcome back to the Trank. So it's been a while since I've posted. It's been getting real cold here in Minnesota, but it's finally about 40 degrees outside, so I figured I'd come out and try to get a video out for you. So today I'm going to be showing 5 tips and tricks for in the shop. They're really useful tricks that I think you're going to find helpful when you're making future furniture projects or just using the equipment in your shop. So it's going to be pretty quick, but I think you're going to enjoy it. So let's go ahead and dive into the video. So this first tip has to do with opening and closing screw clamps. Now, if you've ever dealt with these before, you can know it can be a little bit of a pain and heavy on your wrist to open and close these like I'm doing here. The trick is actually to just put the clamp out in front of you and use a circular rotation to just quickly fold it back on itself and open and close it. You can see it takes less than half the time as the way I showed on the screen before, and it's really quick and easy, and it puts less strain on your wrist. So it's one of those things that you probably haven't noticed before, but it's actually a really great way to do this. So next time you need to use a screw clamp, be sure to try this out opening it, and then once you get it going, you can actually continue to struggle figuring out how to actually adjust the jaws, which is something I still haven't really figured out. Maybe by the time the next video comes out for this, I'll figure out a trick for this one too. Okay, so this next tip has to do with how to check that your combination squares and 90-degree rules are actually reading 90 degrees perfectly. Now, in order to do this, you're going to want a nice sharp pencil or a marking knife in order to get accurate results. But essentially what we're going to do is find a board with a nice straight edge, something like a piece of plywood or just something straight, and we're going to put our rule against it and draw a line. We're then going to flip it around and draw a line using the same reference edge that's very close to the first line. Once we've done this, we can inspect the two lines to see if they're standing perfectly parallel with each other. If they're reading parallel down the entire length, we know that our square is exactly 90 degrees. If there's any discrepancy in those lines, we know that something is off. If you're going to do this with a combination square, you're going to want to use the combination at the very edge of the rule in order to give you the most distance on the pencil line. And we're going to do the exact same process of drawing that first line, then flipping it around, getting as close as we can to the original line, and then repeating the scribe line. Once we take a look at this, we have an even longer path to look at, and our eyes can see very small differences, so you don't really need to measure these. You'll be able to see if those lines start to diverge at all. Now, if you do want to get even more accurate with your work, you can get something like a nice marking knife, something with a very flat bottom, and we can do the exact same process here with something like a machine square, and we can do the exact same thing. The nice thing about using a marking knife is that it gives you a nice positive indent to put something like a caliper in if you actually want to measure the start and end distance of those scribe lines. Again, because the marking knife leaves such a fine line, you can see here it lies right on top of each other, which means that our machine square is at exactly a 90-degree angle. So if you've ever tried to verify that the top of your cast iron table saw is truly flat, you've probably tried using a ruler of some kind and feeler gauges to achieve this. Now, most rulers, unless they're specially made for this, struggle to stand up on their own. This is going to be a cool way to get them to stand up with just a block at home. What you're going to want to do is measure the approximate width of the ruler and then find a saw, whether that's your table saw, a hand saw, or otherwise, that has approximately the same kerf as the width of the rule. Now here we can see that I've raised the blade just to be a little higher than the height of the ruler, and I'm just using a spare wooden block I had on hand to run a groove through the table saw. With this groove made, I can then insert the ruler inside the block, and what it does is provide a little bit of a balance point and a non-tipping point so that you can then use the rule to stand on its edge and check the tabletop. Then you can get your feeler gauges and verify whether the flatness of your cast iron table is actually within the spec. This great thing about this method is that regardless of the block, the rule is still sitting exactly on its edge, and so you're therefore getting a really accurate weight. Now, if you want to do this with something smaller, we can do a different route. Here I have a little 6-inch rule, which is a lot thinner than that larger ruler. And so here what I'm doing is starting with a Japanese pull saw to make a small kerf in a smaller block. And then I'm just following it up with a Western saw to enlarge that kerf slightly. And then because it was still a little thin, I just took a little flush trim saw to flush it out a bit. And then once I've done that, you can see the ruler sits freely in there. So then you can take your small rule with your support block to something smaller like a block plane or other small surface and check for flatness using your feeler gauges. And so this way you don't need to buy a special rule. If you're going to check flatness on your tools, just make a block as I've shown here and you're going to be well on your way. Okay, so we've all seen the playing card trick for when you're trying to set the distance between drawer fronts or just use playing cards for other shims and tasks. Now the thing I don't like about this is anytime you open the drawers or move them around, all your cards fall out. You might forget how many you had making up that shim, and overall I just didn't think it was a great method. So I've done something very simple but something that works out really nicely, which is to make custom sized shims by taping together certain amounts of playing cards. So you can see here I've got these small stacks labeled with how many cards forming the shim. So an 8 shim one is going to be quite a bit thicker than something like a 3 shim stack. Now obviously these are super easy to make and I probably don't really need to explain this, but the way I do it is I just lay out how many cards are going to form the shim, and I take some clear Scotch tape and I just put 2 pieces of tape on, one on each long edge of the playing cards in order to form them together. And then so I can remember how many are in that and what thickness they are, I just put how many cards form that shim in order to make a little set. And then once you've done this, you've got small custom sized shims that stay together, so if they fall through the drawer, they're still together and it's really easy to use them. And then you can do this to, of course, get perfect layout on things like drawer fronts or just use for general shim applications in the shop. Oh, and of course, if you want to make your work more accurate and better, you can just get your pair of festal cards and, make your shims using those. So this next tip is something I saw in a woodworking magazine. I think it might have been Popular Woodworking or something like that. But I thought it was really cool and I wanted to share it with you guys. So we've all used Sawtooth hanger hardware when hanging things like picture frames or other artwork. Now typically you would just drill a couple pilot holes and put this in. Now the problem is, because of how far back the Sawtooth hanger sticks from the artwork, it can actually sag on the wall and you'll have it sticking out and the bottom of the picture frame sagging inward. And I don't think it's the best look. So I'm going to show you a way to do it slightly differently. What we're going to do is find a router bit that's a little bit wider than the Sawtooth hanger hardware, and we are then going to use a router, preferably in a router table, to route a little groove. Now what I'm going to do is raise the bit height to be a little bit deeper than how far the Sawtooth hanger sticks up. We're then going to go back to our picture frame and mark a center line, and then mark a line to the left and right of that to show how long the groove should be. We can then bring it back to the router table and use those 2 lines that we showed for the groove to set something like a couple of stop blocks, because we're going to be doing a stopped groove or a stopped dado on the bottom of the picture frame here. So what I do is I set those and I make sure they're nice and secure, because we're going to be doing a plunge cut. What I can then do is line it up against the stop block and slowly plunge inward, and then bring it forward till it hits the next stop block, and then bring it back and shut off the router and make sure it stops before I lift up the artwork. Now what we're going to be left with is a nice clean little groove here that we can see the Sawtooth hanger perfectly recesses into. We can then do the exact same thing of drilling the little pilot holes and mounting the hardware, but what you're going to see differently this time is once we pin it into place, you'll see that the hardware is sitting nice and flush with the artwork, with the back of the frame that is, and that therefore has barely anything protruding from the top, so that when we do hang this against the wall, the little nail can still go into the Sawtooth hanger, but you can see we've got more like a 32nd of an inch sticking up, and so it's going to sit much more flush and much more cleanly against the wall. Now a simpler way to do this if you have a bit of a thicker frame is to just use a Forstner bit that's appropriately sized to do the exact same thing. Now you can see how this wouldn't work on a thin picture frame, but if you have something that's 1 inch or 2 like this, you can just drill that hole out and then recess the Sawtooth hanger, and you skip the hassle of having to deal with a plunge cut with the router. So it's a really neat and professional way to hang your piece, and so I hope you give this one a try and see how it goes.
Alright, thanks for watching the video, guys. Hopefully you found at least a couple of these tips to be useful and are things that you can try at home in your projects. If you did like it, be sure to leave the video a like and subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. I've got a lot of great content coming here, including an awesome table build that I just finished. You're really not going to want to miss this one. So be sure to stay tuned. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.